Total War Shogun 2 is a perplexing game. The context surrounding its release makes it one. Just 2 years prior, we were greeted with Empire Total War, a game that not only brought about major design shifts and additions like real-time naval battles, but wasn't released in a very good state, and to this day it kinda runs like crap. Shogun 2 was made only more peculiar in the context of everything that followed, the botched release of Rome 2, which, as I have demonstrated in previous videos, is still anything but a good game, and the increasingly scummy DLC practices of the Warhammer Total War games, which also happen to inherit all the major design problems introduced by Rome 2, as well as its own single entity spam and doom stacks. That era of 2011 to 2012, which saw Shogun 2's release and later the release of the standalone Fall of the Samurai expansion pack, was this weird interlude where they got almost everything just right. Whereas Shogun 1, Medieval 1 and 2 and Rome 1 had clunky control schemes, sluggish cameras and poor mouse inputs, Shogun 2 inherited one of the few things Empire did almost unequivocally well: a modern, responsive, snappy user interface. I grew up playing quite a bit of Medieval 2 and the game's Kingdoms expansion, as well as the accompanying Third Age mod, but as I've become a more serious gamer, I find it harder and harder to go back to that game, mostly because of its clunky battle controls. If there's one thing that can spoil an otherwise good game, it's that. And while Rome 2 and subsequent games proceeded to neglect their multiplayer modes, Troy going as far as to release without one, Shogun 2 gave us Avatar Conquest. It has an army painter, the Warhammer games don't. Whatever your opinions on this mode are, be it a competitive venue for min-maxing and personalizing your armies, or a venue for the experience to dunk all over the newcomers, you can't deny that it was an ambitious thing to include in a series that may have always been perceived as primarily single player. And even if that wasn't to your taste, you could still do battle with the classic factions, and by enabling key buildings, the battles effectively moderated themselves by compelling players to actually compete with one another. For the first and only time in the franchise's history, we had one game combining modern, refined controls with good-looking graphics that still hold up fine and a robust multiplayer offering. So what are we talking about here today? Shogun 2 is an interesting game to examine because, as it sits in the interlude between quote classic and quote modern Total War, it combines a lot of elements from both. Well implemented overall, but a tragic failure in some aspects and a foreshadowing of problems that would plague the later titles. Oh, you can attach them. Oh, I will make this weird contraption work. Yes, we did it. Look, guys, you see, I am an actual boss right now. You're so ugly, you could be a modern art masterpiece. Yes, I very deliberately put this point in Chapter 1. Shogun 2 often gets criticized for a lack of variety in his factions. After all, they all share most of their units and the faction-specific buffs are mostly quite minor. I've already pointed out in past videos that the whole unit/faction variety of games like Warhammer 2 is surface level. Melee infantry lose versus themselves on higher difficulties, leading to a meta of spamming ranged and single entity units. Of course, you can always just roleplay as a ruler fielding balanced armies, but a game doesn't deserve to get points based on made-up house rules. I maintain that the only correct way to judge a game's design is to view it as played by someone aiming to win in the most efficient, optimized way possible, because that's really the only fair metric. Shogun 2 has an interesting approach to variety. While it is true that most units are shared between clans, in practice your ability to field them is restricted by what you can build, which is in turn determined by what you choose to research. And by research, I'm not talking about accumulating passive stat buffs. While there are some bonuses to unit experience or clan happiness to be gained, the vast majority of these arts are unlocking a unit or building. Sometimes unlocking a building that will grant you access to a unit should you choose to build it. The overarching limitation is that you simply won't be able to research everything in a campaign, even with all the research speed buffs you can accumulate. There's opportunity costs all over. In one Oda campaign, you can choose to follow Nobunaga's footsteps, research gunpowder mastery, and field all manners of firearm-equipped regiments and ships. In another, you can opt for Katana Samurai, formidable in a brawl but fragile if misused, while strengthening your cavalry corps with the thundering Katana Cavalry. But it goes further than that. You can secure your western front by allying whoever dominates central Japan in the opening phases of the campaign, cunningly create a small navy, ship a strike force to Kyushu, and proceed to take a province and make contact with the Portuguese, giving you access to imported guns well before your peers, allowing you to field matchlock Ashigaru alongside more traditional melee infantry. Of course, this comes at the cost of religious unrest. Or conversion could have been part of your plan all along, in which case it's a feature, not a bug. If you go that route, you can start spreading that faith in central Japan, using agents to incite revolts, devastating your rivals, potentially without ever fighting them directly. Or if you're funny and you came only for the guns, you can opt to abandon your colony and just focus your expansion in central Japan. Also, you can let the rebels take over Bungo, start building a non-bond trade port back in your home territories, and then retake the one in Bungo, and there you have bypassed the restriction on having only one of these. Also, while you're out on that western expedition, you can bully the Hojo clan into a military alliance after seizing half their lands, bait the feared Takeda Shingen into a trap, where he overextends himself instead of concentrating his 4 armies to attack you all at once, and then kill his successor the next turn. There's nothing quite like deliberately getting embroiled in a multi-front war, and proceeding to win it. Yes, that's just one faction. It's important to remember that while all these clans are the same in matters of unit rosters and the objective of taking the capital, there is still one aspect where they are all unique: their starting positions. This makes it really curious when someone argues the game carries no replay value or faction variety because, quote, the factions are all the same, as if to imply that changing your starting position doesn't significantly affect your approach to the opening. The Chosokabe are another good example of replayability, and one that may be familiar to most players. The first few turns will see you unifying the island under your control, and after that it's very open-ended. The traditional expansion option is Kyushu. It's rich, easy to defend once you conquer the whole of it, is close to the trade nodes, and will give you access to imported guns if you still don't have them. But it's quite a bit out of the way from your campaign objectives of controlling Setsu and Kyoto. So you can instead ship your army into central Japan, which is also quite a rich region and one that will give you access to better ninja agents. In fact, there's no other region of Japan with ninja specialty provinces giving you a monopoly on their supply. That extra cash will come in handy replacing your ninja, and you will be doing that a lot given how much the AI loves its Metsuke. This expansion option will give you access to better scouting, crucial for keeping your armies from getting isolated in the perilous realm divide. But it also means that you will be forced to fight on multiple fronts. Or you can just land anywhere else really. You can go over to Izu and take over its gold mine before neutralizing the Hojo, saving yourself the trouble of fighting them later on when they are the most powerful faction on the map. It also means eastern factions like the Takeda, Satake and Date are less likely to launch naval invasions on your home island. The AI prefers attacking overland given the option. But what if you like pain? Wasuge. I am going to pillage every single Ikuiki province right now. I don't care if it makes any strategic sense or not. I'm so petty right now. I'm gonna pillage every single province they have. There are 3 main roads into their provinces. 3 approaches they can be attacked from, but also 3 they can expand through. Going west means knocking the Ikuiki out early. More challenging perhaps, but it will pay dividends not having to face that menace in the later phases of the game. Wasuge may or may not be the toughest faction, but they will test your willingness to abandon your plans based on the rapidly changing strategic landscape. This is thoughtful, interesting faction differentiation and replayability. It's not about changing the look of your interface, or the skins of your units, or their voice lines. Those can add to the immersion, sure, but they are not something that makes the gameplay meaningfully different. But faction differentiation is more than just presenting different scenarios. It's about making you a better player. The Ikuiki are the only faction in Shogun 2 to lack Metsukes, an important backbone of other clans' economies. It's tough to adjust to at first, especially when you also need to manage the clan's unique religion and units, but when it's all done, When you overcome that hurdle, when you taste victory after a campaign full of uncertainty and setbacks, where your monk garrisons are under relentless pressure from multiple enemies, you've become a better player. You beat the game with less. You're now ready to play those other factions, to put to use the lessons you've learned, to become more efficient in your ruthless pursuit of victory. If a game has you doing that, and it might be doing that without you even realizing, then it might just be a good video game.
He's dead. I found him. I found Kenshin. I found Kenshin. He's dead.
What happens if I jump on this crap? Okay, no, I thought maybe I might... Oh! After busting the whole myth of this game not having strong replay value, it only makes sense to tackle the topic of unit variety. I normally avoid using this term unironically, as it's become a euphemism for I have no idea what I'm talking about, but this sounds like a good point to make about insert favorite game here. On the surface, there's not much going on here. You have spear infantry, sword infantry, bow infantry, and so on, and the usual RTS, RTT setup. There's a strong sense of rock, paper, scissors in this design, but unlike the combat of more mainstream RTS titles that is predominantly determined by stats and compositions, morale and terrain modifiers allow a bit of fluidity in battle. Bow samurai are traditionally awful in the melee, but give them the high ground, charge them into the enemy and keep your general nearby, and they can still give a good account of themselves as they tie down enemy forces for a significant length of time. Bow Ashigaru are even worse off in close quarters, but they can still provide a needed morale shock if you've thrown down all your other cards. Katana Samurai? They are the anti-infantry brawler, tearing apart common spear infantry and doing admirably versus heavier Naginata Samurai and warrior monks, but also liable to taking horrific casualties from a cavalry charge. But should your Katana Samurai intercept a unit of cavalry before it makes the decisive move, they can trade reasonably well with their mounted enemy, pinning them down long enough for your cavalry or Yari to deal the finishing blow. Best of all, to demonstrate my point, light cavalry. It's common wisdom to forgo these guys once you get access to the heavier forms of cavalry, but I will very gladly take these guys with me to the very end of the campaign. The morale shock from flanks and rear attacks is so decisive that the mobility advantage of light cavalry alone is enough to sell them. Notice how throughout these examples, the importance of terrain, positioning, morale permeates, adding another layer to the combat beyond simple rock, paper, scissors. It's either too expensive or too time consuming to field whole armies of specialist samurai units. Almost every force you put together will have a deficiency somewhere, whether it's a lack of heavy infantry, the absence of heavy cavalry, or a lack of high quality archers. What separates a good player from a great one is their ability to leverage these all-encompassing gameplay elements to make up for the shortcomings of their compositions. And that flows from a design philosophy that seeks to leave a well-defined role for every unit. A lot of players may be confused by Yari Samurai, a unit that loses to Yari Ashigaru in Yari Wall, while Yari Ashigaru are competent at dealing with cavalry too. Yet Yari Samurai do find themselves a purpose in spite of that. It's a niche purpose, but also an incredibly potent one. Yari Samurai come to field with the samurai morale, which means they can operate independently of your main force, deterring roaming cavalry, and even making a play for the enemy general after he commits his soldiers to the main fight. Just one of these can be enough to pull you out of a precarious situation. In multiplayer especially, you can see that Yari Samurai do have a very important role to play in accompanying your cavalry on the flanks, as they don't need to be micromanaged due to their superior morale. Even units that seem to overlap heavily manage to differentiate themselves in interesting manners. Take Matchlock Ashigaru and Matchlock Samurai. The Samurai unit has fewer men but better stats in every aspect, firing much faster and more accurately, devastating anyone approaching an entrenched position. If you had access to both the Ashigaru and the Samurai, why would you even consider the former, outside of them being cheaper? Look more closely. You'll see that unlike with archers, matchlock units don't receive more ammunition as you go up the stack. Monks, Samurai, Ashigaru, they all bring the same amount of lead to the fight. This means Matchlock Samurai, left to their own devices, will expend their ammo faster than their less skilled counterparts. It's a double-edged sword. The samurai will rack up kills faster, but should they run out of ammo while the enemy force is still at large, you're now left with a glorified unit of katana samurai, except with none of the benefits of katana. Gunfire carries a heavy morale penalty, and running out of ammo can leave you in a perilous spot as suddenly, enemy units become much harder to rout. You can turn off fire at will and manually select targets, but the problem is just that. It adds another layer of micromanagement which you may not be able to keep up with. This is where Matchlock Ashigaru come in. The slower fire rates can actually work in your favor. You're less likely to lose your important morale breaker mid-battle. A similar dynamic can be seen in Fall of the Samurai, where Levy infantry have a much slower rate of fire and more ammo than line infantry, especially useful in longer siege defenses.
Oh, do I have to roll this guy around? Can I roll him around? Come on. Wait, how am I even supposed to get him on it? And now the wind's pushing it. Oh, that's how I'm supposed to do. Okay, you get over here. I guess that's what we're doing this time.
There's just one problem with the balancing in this game. Actually multiple. All of those strong distinctions between yari, katana, bows, matchlocks, and all the different types of cavalry. It all functions at the outset of the campaign. But the lines start to blur and the balance gets eroded as two things happen in conjunction. Your generals start gaining levels and your units climb in experience. There's a shift in the balance that often remains subtle, until you reach a late game battle where a high experienced samurai unit refuses to rout, even as you surround it and even as its friends are being routed. Power creep, or experience creep, has been a problem since the very first Total War game, and has remained such to this day. Your basic infantry becomes so incredibly potent that it's just not cost effective to field the more advanced unit types. Why even consider an expensive unit of the lumbering Naginata samurai when your Yari Ashigaru can match or even surpass its morale and combat prowess with enough experience while being cheaper and easier to replace? Why bother with Yari cavalry when light cavalry will rack up experience as it chases down hundreds or thousands of routing men per battle? It doesn't help that stand and fight is a no-brainer ability, offering further morale and attack buffs to already experienced units, making even Ashigaru nigh unbreakable. And even without that ability, the more your general ranks up, the more passive morale bonuses he'll confer onto his army. If you've played the later Total War games, especially the Warhammer titles, or if you've watched my previous critiques, this may already sound familiar: stat stacking. At some point your daimyo and his generals will have multiple command stars and be leading hordes of experienced units, making many battles foregone conclusions. Even your newly created armies will be quite potent, as castle and building upgrades and military arts will grant XP bonuses to certain unit classes. With a Swordmaster school and sword expertise, you can churn out a 4 XP Nodachi Samurai in just one turn. The underlying problem here is what unit experience actually does. Every level of experience confers the same exact bonuses, no matter the unit, and these are flat bonuses, which means a couple of things. First is that Ashigaru are disproportionately benefited, especially in terms of shoring up their morale. The second is that the buffs aren't at all context sensitive. Why on earth does a unit of bow samurai that has been firing from behind my lines suddenly become more proficient in a melee? There's nothing interesting or engaging about collecting every tactical advantage you can, fighting on good terrain, flanking, enveloping units, getting clean charges, only to watch as a unit refuses to even waver. Tactically, it encourages extreme levels of kiting and cycle charging. Strategically, it encourages meeting strength with strength, bringing your own powerful units to stat check your opponent, rather than encouraging resourcefulness. A better way to handle this would have been to make the experience affect unit classes differently. Say, a unit of Yari Ashigaru will hold its formation better, instead of receiving morale buffs that allow it to take clean cavalry charges to the rear and still come out on top. Fall of the Samurai isn't spared from this problem. In fact, it's even worse. Line infantry are available from the outset and can use kneel fire and suppression fire once you research them. The more elite rifle units like guard infantry and marines don't bring anything unique to the field outside of better stats while costing much more. I have hundreds of hours in this expansion and have completed campaigns with most of the factions, and until now, I haven't recruited a single unit of guard infantry or guard cavalry, because line infantry with Neilfire and a few chevrons of experience will handily lay waste to most armies. And in those rare cases where line infantry are overcome, whether by sheer numbers combined with their low ammo, or by Shogatai hordes, it's trivial to create a replacement army to face down the depleted enemy forces. On the flip side, there aren't as many scenarios in this campaign where I encounter difficulty routing highly experienced infantry, because the added melee attack and defense don't offer any protection against bullets. It's just very strange to come from the Sengoku campaign, where Ashigaru samurai and monks have their own unique roles and don't simply obsolesce one another as you go up the stack, to follow the samurai where line infantry are so incredibly cost effective as to make the later units superfluous. And yet, despite these shortcomings, these two entries are still very good games. It turns out that by giving your game a solid foundation, it can stand in spite of structural issues. In a game like Follow the Samurai, where a large chunk of the roster is hardly worth considering, the experience is saved by its other dimensions, morale and terrain. Even if you and your opponent are fielding the same compositions, there's still a game to be played as you try to collect advantages beyond unit quality. You can neutralize the enemy's rifles by positioning your army behind a blacksmith, causing them to bunch the units up together, obstructing one another as they enter your overlapping zones of fire. In siege defenses, you can adopt a scorched earth policy, placing the advancing forces under constant gunfire, and burning down your own gates to entice them into a nasty choke point. And in siege assaults, you can establish a foothold in the fort, tying down any units moving to intercept you while you rush your gun infantry to form up their lines for a close quarter shootout. But it would only get worse going forward. Rome 2 made morale penalties negligible, units routing only after losing the vast majority of their men and health anyway. There's very little that can be done to shorten the pace of battle, and the optimal mode of play is to bring the best units you can, tactics be damned. A few games later we got single entity doom stacks, because these units are endowed with high amounts of health while having strong stats in other areas. The perfect counter to the AI's melee infantry, who gain significant buffs to their morale and melee on higher difficulties. Shogun 2 didn't confer any combat buffs to the AI, except weirdly for reload rate and accuracy, turning bow samurai into modern day snipers. If you've ever wondered why battles in this game are so fast, it's not just the focus on melee attack and charge bonus. It's just not feasible to skirmish the AI, barring excessive kiting or Chosokabe Daikyu samurai, or fire rockets that are only a late game unit, in turn fostering a meta of closing the distance as quickly as possible, preferably dragging the enemy into a fight in forested terrain. I'm so petty towards bow samurai that I have tabs on specific battle maps in the campaign that have either a huge slope or a lot of tree cover, or both, like this one right here by the lake in Umi. But barring an extreme level of awareness of the different maps you can get, the supremacy of enemy archers, when combined with the AI already having an advantage in numbers, will funnel you towards army compositions prioritizing speed and charge bonus, attributes that are conducive to resolving a battle as quickly as possible. The balance becomes even more distorted in the late game by the morale bonuses provided by experienced generals, as well as the increased hit points conferred to these generals, making their soldiers nigh impossible to rout and the generals capable of withstanding bullets, multiple charges by cavalry, getting swarmed by your units, sometimes escaping with their lives in the face of all this. I've developed a few bad habits to cope with this insanity. I have to zoom in on the general's bodyguard unit and patiently watch as my cavalry faff about trying to stick him with a spear, blinding myself to everything else transpiring on the field. All because units won't shatter if their general survives and routs, only if he's killed outright. Your men will be left at a hefty disadvantage too, if they aren't led by an experienced general while facing down such an enemy force. Rome 2 made it impossible to recruit units into leaderless armies, a much maligned change, and I share the negative sentiment around it, as it does indeed reduce your freedom while turning the campaigns into endgame simulators, as you wait for your limited armies to complete objectives, because you can't divide your forces to achieve different goals. But Shogun 2 was already quite heavily discouraging you from fielding armies without generals. Unit experience, general experience coming together to distort the balance in what was a foreshadowing of things to come. And here we observe the moblin in his natural habitat as he performs a combat call, or whatever you call it, against the unamused sentinel. Oh, his weapon got burnt. Okay.
This is weirdly captivating, actually. Oh wow, he just headbutted that guy into oblivion.
Medieval 2's building system isn't as good or thoughtful as you remember. Why am I saying this? Because Empire's botched release has people going further than just pointing out that game's issues, and instead contrasting Empire with Medieval 2 in a manner almost entirely favorable to the latter. Empire restricted building slots and brought us minor towns within a province, which took the form of buildings that existed outside of the main settlement and came with their own functions and upgrade paths. Napoleon adapted this system to be even more rigid, in that you don't have minor settlements popping up in a province as time goes on. In Shogun 2, while settlements can be upgraded and expanded, every province features only one farm and at most one port, with some having an additional specialty building. I remember back when the game came out that there was some negative sentiment towards the system being overly restrictive, and it was often compared unfavorably to the Roman Medieval 2 system, where building was primarily restricted by what you could afford. But I'm fine with the system as featured in Shogun 2, as it isn't completely arbitrary, and there is still quite a bit of room for customizing and optimizing settlements towards a given role. For one, all settlements are equally upgradable, no matter how poor their farmland is or their geographic location. This is in contrast to the province-region system introduced in Rome 2 and still in use to this day, where there are predetermined major settlements and minor ones, which has the negative effect of railroading your expansion. If you seize one region in the province, you're heavily incentivized towards taking the rest. With all settlements being equally upgradable, your expansion options have the potential to be more dynamic. In the Takeda campaign, the game nudges you towards expanding northwards as your first move, as you begin at war with the Murakami clan. You could follow that encouragement, steering yourself towards an early confrontation with the Iko-Iki, Oda, and Wasuge, while friendly relations with the Imagawa and Hojo secure your southern frontier. Or you could take my preferred option, and that is to drive a wedge between the Imagawa and Hojo by selling the Imagawa military access in exchange for severing their alliance with the Hojo, whose blacksmith and gold mine are lucrative assets, while you leave a small garrison guarding Kai against northern threats. Or you could choose to keep the Hojo on your side, expanding into the Imagawa provinces, which form a nice little corridor through which to continue into central Japan. These options materialize partly because each and every province is a potential point of defense, where you can set your front line. I'm not contending with a bunch of minor settlements that are permanently minor, indefensible settlements because the developers made all the choices for you. Provinces may have their natural geography, the placement of settlements and minor towns, and their fertility set in stone and unchanging from campaign to campaign. But what isn't set in stone is the political landscape and the military infrastructure. You might commit yourself to a certain expansion route and then change your objective because you spotted an upgraded settlement and the opportunity to seize the assets the AI built for yourself. Or because multiple armies emerge from the fog of war to target Ichigo, you decide to pull back Wasuge Kenshin from his eastward invasion to bolster your capital's defense. After which you decide to mount a massive counterattack against the Iko-Iki towards your west. It really helps that the AI does a competent job of keeping up with the player, something I've noticed the lack of in later titles. And it's honestly frustrating to hear the claim that it's not reasonable to expect competent AI, because there is at least one Total War game where they mostly succeeded in giving us that, as far as the campaign is concerned. The building system of Rome 1 and Medieval 2 gets praised for allowing you more freedom in building out your settlements, but in practice, as far as Medieval 2 is concerned, it's so damn easy to make money hand over fist that you will just be building everything everywhere because you might as well. Money is a bit harder to come by in Shogun 2, and the biggest source of cash, looting, requires you to be actively fighting, while the limited building slots add another layer of opportunity costs over research. You may come across a province containing a building you haven't obtained access to yourself, which would alter, sometimes significantly, the course of your campaign. There is one final ingredient that ties the campaign progression all together: realm divide. And it's such a great decision that I couldn't do it justice without dedicating a whole chapter to it.
Yeah, you come here, come here, come here, come here, come here. Come here, come here, come here. I'm right here, 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 I'm right here. I'm right here. Here he comes! Oh! They're dead. He's dead. Whoa, 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 whoa.
Realm divide is a polarizing topic. Some hate it for making diplomacy pointless. Others praise it for making the late game actually challenging, which has been something Total War games have struggled with for a long time. It does indeed make diplomacy pointless. While you can cultivate an alliance with a clan or two who will stick with you beyond the divide, it's far from necessary to win the game. But I don't think that's a bad thing, necessarily. Total War was originally conceived as a battle simulator, with Shogun 2 being no exception. Criticizing it for making diplomacy pointless comes off as barking up the wrong tree. Realm Divide is one of the best ideas the series came up with, not only providing a late game challenge but also working to support what Total War was all about in the first place: battles. Realm Divide is where a lot of us have fond memories of those cataclysmic engagements involving upwards of 10,000 men, where you leveraged all your resources and everything learned up to that point against clans who made it as far as you did. And it incidentally helped to simulate a little political theory called the security dilemma. It's an interpretation of politics and history where every power seeks to guarantee its own survival by improving its own security, and that is primarily through seizing land and the resources that come with it. There's one major paradox outlined by this theory. As a power defeats and subjugates its immediate neighbors, it will come into contact with other powers who won in their own neighborhood. And so these nations and empires that won their initial round will start another round of conflicts, where each party attempts to improve its security against the others. Again, primarily by seizing land and resources. The paradox here is that no one ever really manages to achieve security in this environment, because they all view security as a zero-sum game. Seizing land will naturally come at somebody else's expense. Rather than staving off war, which would be the goal of security, the drive to gain power at a rival's expense drives everyone to war instead of away from it. Of course, theory is never completely replicated in reality. It is called theory after all, but it's nonetheless interesting to see how Shogun 2 models this idea. Now, I do know that a lot of strategy and tactics games out there do simulate this feast or famine theory to some extent, but they are more often than not let down by an incompetent AI whom the player will quickly surpass. Shogun 2 manages to avoid this. These are a few different campaigns where you can very quickly spot a few AI factions rivaling my own. Realm Divide doesn't feel like a crude take on a final boss. It feels more like the natural conclusion to the struggle encompassing the whole map. If you're so clearly about to eclipse the other factions, why wouldn't they, and why shouldn't they, both in real and gameplay terms, set aside their differences to fight what they know could be the very thing that destroys them?
You know what I'm thinking, right? We're going into the Colosseum, boys. You mark my words. We're going to dominate.
If you're coming from Medieval 2 with its expansive cities and castles, Shogun 2's siege maps will seem underwhelming. The first two tiers of fortification are just a raised plateau with parapets and gatehouses, the walls being scalable by any infantry unit. The sieges really come into their own when you realize the developers clearly wanted you to use the whole map. Think of it like this. There are no siege maps in this game. There are field battles where the defender gets some fortifications. For this reason, I don't find the frequency of sieges to be very annoying. They are just a different take on field battles and are great in their own right.
Alright guys, so here we have loaded in the Arai Castle map, and for those of you familiar with my channel, I actually quite like this fort map in particular. I think it's the best one overall because there's there's a lot of slopes. There's also a lot of impassable terrain, which forces the eye to spread out its forces. Enemy reinforcements who load in from the bottom of the map take an extremely long time to get up, so ample time to engage in defeat in detail of the starting army. Now, I'll get to the fort in a second, but you're going to start your battlefield considerations with establishing an outer defense, placing your defensive line as far forward as you possibly can, because unlike the fort where the terrain is mostly flat, so you're not fighting with a terrain advantage in these areas. You're fighting on flat ground, which can be pretty bad against samurai units, which the AI feels a lot of. You can take advantage of this pretty significant slope on this side. Sometimes the AI will spawn some units down on that section towards the northeast based on the minimap, and then there's down here, which is towards the north, towards the southeast. You can place some lines of Yari Ashigaru on this side as well as on this side if you have enough. But if you don't have enough, what you could do is you could try and defeat this section as quickly as possible and then swing them around and get them up onto this fort. Or you could just take your limited Yari Ashigaru, like 3 of them, and place them on this peak, so that you've basically created your own fort, and then you can slowly push down the slope, maybe support with some katana. You might be able to get your archers to support as well. They have long enough range, especially if it's bow warrior monks, they can reach that far. And follow the samurai, similar things. You can have some fire support, start a melee in this section, have some fire support, and it's really great because in follow the samurai, these slopes, this granularity in the terrain can block the line of sight of enemy rifle units, so they could end up also blocking themselves. And I did that in one siege defense previously on the channel that I featured, where the first unit will block the rest of the enemy units from firing, so you can just carry that momentum down the slope and not take any rifle fire. You can also, interestingly, this peak is actually higher than this section of the fort, than this courtyard. You could actually place ranged units in here and have them fire upwards. You can place a unit here and then have the second line fire at the same time, having an overlapping zone of fire, which is interesting. But at the same time, the AI can fire directly in, so it's not completely within your advantage. Now, the thing is, once you've defeated this section, assuming that there's still more forces left on the map, or assuming a pretty bad fight, and I've featured quite a few of those, you could quickly swing around, pull your units back into the fort, and then fight them towards the west. Or you could do the opposite. Instead of taking advantage of that slope in that direction, you could have some units hold the Tenshu in the fort just to buy you time, and then rush down the slope instead. Usually the generals like to spawn here, so you can get rid of the general early. The only issue is there tends to be a lot of enemy archers, and there's a lot of open terrain over here, so enemy archers will have a field day. And there's also a risk that if you go this far forward, if enemy archers or enemy units spawn in this section, especially cavalry, you could risk enveloping yourself. Though you could counter that if you have enough spear infantry or just enough units to spare to cover the entire front. You can do that, especially with kneel fire and follow the samurai. It can be quite effective, but it's also very risky, but also quite rewarding at the same time if you do get rid of the general early. Another point of interest is this weird winding path on this slope on this section. You can interestingly place artillery. If you're attacking, you can place artillery or skirmishers on this and fire directly into the fort. It gives you a really good vantage point to fire from, though you can actually trick return fire from the enemy. You could also place some units of Yari Ashigaru on this path, this winding path. It's an extremely good choke point, and just tie up an unseemly amount of enemy units, just them trying to get through your Yari Ashigaru. And if they have enough experience, and they should be pretty protected in this scenario, then they can actually pull away a significant number of enemy forces. You could also alternatively, instead of after defeating the elements that have spawned on the eastern side of the map, you have quite a few options. If there are enemy reinforcements coming in, you could just do the safe thing and run back into the Tenshu. Or you could push the advantage further and try and catch them on the slope and this forested area where enemy archers will be quite ineffective. The issue is, yet again, you're leaving your rear potentially exposed. Enemy units, cavalry units might come through this section, through this sort of pass, this corridor. They might decide to hit you in the rear. You could, of course, just place the units of Yari Ashigaru to block that in a sort of rear guard action, but they might not hold very long, especially if you're fighting high quality units. Eventually they're gonna break, and then you might potentially have your entire rear exposed. But then again, so many risks to take, so many different scenarios, and we haven't even gone to the fort section yet. There's a lot you can do in the fort itself, where you can place the unit of Yari Ashigaru down here, or any melee infantry, have archers or matchlocks manning the walls in the rear, while you have more matchlocks on this section, so you create all these overlapping zones of fire. And if the enemy is defeated in this courtyard, you can take these units of matchlocks and then spread them out, move them towards this section of the wall to give some fire supports to any units, or give some fire to any units that are approaching this section. So the battle line is constantly dynamic. You're constantly moving and shifting the battle line around depending on how far the enemy gets and how successful you are in different sectors. It's a similar thing in this section. You can have a unit of matchlocks placed on this section of the wall. If they manage to rout the enemy units in this courtyard, they can quickly be moved around to this section to cover the approach in this area, or they could just be pulled back towards this section of the walls. There's so much you can do, and like it's just constantly popping up into my head, all these different scenarios, all these different setups you can go for inside the fort. You can place a unit of Ashigaru or any other bait unit in this tiny alcove basically, and have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units of missiles giving absolute hell to whoever decides to approach down this section. There's also the potential, this is also an interesting sector, there's potential for overlapping zones of fire from up to 3 levels, or these 2 levels. You can have men from the Tenchu firing down. And interestingly, this is also one of those fort maps. It's one of the few fort maps where you can directly climb into the Tenchu from the outside, which as the defender, you still have to take that into account, but as the attacker, you can actually take advantage of this. You can send in 1 unit to the fort and block off the section. I don't know why this isn't working. Okay. And block off this section, establish a foothold in the fort, block off this section, so any units that are attempting to intervene to try and intercept your units entering the Tenchu will get caught on this Yari Ashigaru. And I've done this to take over a Musashi on, I think, turn 2 or turn 3 and follow the Samurai. It's where the Josei start out, and it's an upgraded fort. You can block off any of the garrison units by placing a unit of Spear Levy here, and then send in the unit of Yarikachi to cap the flag. It's just amazing. You could also just go the more conventional route and burn down these gates and slowly gain control of the fort, gain control of this courtyard and this fort tower, and then push on further. You could also, theoretically, I've also done this as well, where you basically turn a siege assault into a siege defense midway through by capturing the Tenchu, and then the enemy reinforcements decide to arrive at that moment, and they're caught in a complete reverse scenario. You can capture the flag right away and end the battle, but there is a chance that many of the enemy soldiers will survive. So instead, you can deliberately extend the fight and make them attack you, and make them suffer horrific losses before you take the flag. It's just, there's so much you could do, and this is just one fort map, and I don't want to dwell too long on this because this is just way too long already, but you get the point. The settlements don't look very detailed compared to, say, Medieval 2 or Rome 1, or even Rome 2. The major settlements look more detailed. But make no mistake, this game, they were clearly trying to get you to use the whole map. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of stuff to work with on a map like this. And they were clearly trying to get you to think outside of the box, or outside of the fort, literally. It's not just a tower defense game. There is one thing I find somewhat lacking, and that is the absence of deployable defenses in sieges. It would have added so much more if units could dig trenches and other earthworks during sieges, both attackers and defenders. Though interestingly, Yari Ashigaru can perform this role in a crude manner, preventing units from scaling walls and pinning them down in courtyards. What really dampens the experience is the unresponsiveness of units inside the fort, specifically when trying to place units on the parapets or pull them off. There is a strong emphasis on defense in depth in these fights, on giving ground, fighting on multiple fronts and redeploying units to gain a local advantage. But this bugginess puts an infuriating cap on how ambitious you can be. It gets to the point where I will place ranged units on the walls and attempt to keep them there for the entire duration of the battle. It gets especially bad in Fall of the Samurai, where line infantry are the core of an army and need to form up their entire line until they even consider they might want to fire. In spite of that,
These siege defenses are still the best the series has ever managed, with a strong emphasis on movements, defeat in detail, and creating overlapping zones of fire. More functional than the earlier iterations and far more interesting than the glorified tower defense of the later ones. It's a little worse for wear, but seems to be functioning fine. Oh my god, Rubidium, the screen fades to black and oh, it's a little worse for wear, but seems to be functioning fine. Shogun 2 inherits an annoying element from Empire where all of the status icons of a unit are grouped together, cycling through one another. Thankfully, Shogun 2 does get the benefit of snappy mouse controls. Nothing kills Medieval 2 like having to train yourself around the input delays for dragging units and using the drag box. It is very annoying, however, to have the camera speed scale with frame rate. It might not have been so noticeable back at release, but with modern hardware, the game's single-threaded optimization leads to jarring fluctuations in camera speed. I've noticed this as a recurring problem with these overhead camera types of games. You can see this be very annoying in Frostpunk, where the camera is incredibly jerky when few assets are featured in the early game. Worst of all, the UI doesn't scale with resolution, so it becomes difficult to even play the game at anything above 1080p, which was considered high-end in 2011. Other than that though, the game makes a very good job of using colors to convey information at a glance. Samurai units are given red and orange portraits on their cards in contrast to the green of Ashigaru. There's even more granularity in the design. Yari cavalry are given a mixture of blue and red, compared to the red and green of Katana cavalry and the greenish blue of light cavalry. Whereas Rome 2 not only has units within the same class that have minor stat differences, but portrays them with indistinguishable unit cards. Then the Warhammer games present us with unit cards that for some reason are very dark. You're not easily distinguishing these units until you have experience playing the game. Don't get me started on the ghost figures in Three Kingdoms. Why is this important? RTT games are very time sensitive. The UI should serve a purely supporting role and never getting in your way. There's more. With an effective use of color and a consistent design language, I can within seconds gauge the threat posed by an enemy force. The moment I see a bunch of cards featuring red armor, I know I'm going to be fighting a tough battle. This is a much more engaging, more inviting system to interface with than having to trudge through stat sheets like some sort of accountant. I'll also roll a few clips of Battlefield 1 where enemy soldiers outfitted in dark uniforms are difficult to spot until they start firing, their muzzle flash giving away their positions. It would not be the same if your screen was cluttered with arrows and icons telling you this, as so many modern games are wont to do. You might almost convince yourself you're down there in the heat of battle. If there's one thing that good games all have in common, no matter their genre and no matter their age, it's their understanding that the best user interface is the one that has to do the least amount of work. They make use of in-game visuals and audio to convey information to you in an organic manner. Dead bodies, particle effects, gunshots, all of these elements serve a purpose beyond the superficial. I don't need to sift through all my unit cards, taking my eyes off the battle for precious seconds to see if my guns are doing their job. I can see the muzzle flash and the lingering smoke clouds, and if they're not in view, I can hear the gunfire even from the other side of the field.
Prepare to attack, sir.
These cues have been lost in the newer titles. Missile fire is inaudible without zooming in, and guns barely have any muzzle flash or smoke effects to speak of. And this is in a game where any criticism will elicit the great response. Don't care, looks cool. As if to imply that a well-designed game and a visually pleasing one are mutually exclusive. The Takeda cavalry have been defeated. The only cavalry they have left are generals. And my archers are beginning to fire over there in the fort. They're already exchanging fire. I'm swinging my Yari wall around now to fight the Hojo Yari Ashigaru who are my rear. And for whatever it's worth, Shogun 2 had dedicated sound effects for soldiers mounting and dismounting. How many of you have ever even used this? Yes, Modern Art 2.0. A modern art masterpiece. No. Okay, yeah, there's the recall. I want to take this recall thing. Take her up. Whoa. Whoa. Real-time strategy games have unfortunately been defined for a long time by their high APM floor, or actions per minute floor. High APM games have a place, but at the same time, there is a definite lack of RTS and RTT titles that cater to an audience that favors more cerebral gameplay, a niche that Total War filled for a while. As I mentioned earlier, Shogun 2 starts off on an excellent note with its usage of colors, but even Shogun 1 a decade earlier had very legible unit cards. There was no mistaking a unit of Yari Samurai for no Dachi. Empire had the subtle detail of line infantry and its derivative standing in an upright pose, while light infantry and skirmishers were crouched, alluding to their better stealth. Visuals are only one part of that interface equation. The other major element is the interactive, the button clicking. In an ideal game, each and every button click carries behind it an important decision, even if it's done subconsciously and within fractions of a second. In Total War specifically, that minimal APM is the product of unit design and combat balance. In Shogun 2, the vast majority of unit qualities are baked into the unit itself. Katana Samurai perform favorably on the charge and in a protracted melee. There is no special button to press here. The unit has a clearly stated purpose. It will excel in certain scenarios and falter in others, and your goal is to pursue the former while preventing or mitigating the latter. By allowing units to be decisive, there's a knock-on effect of reducing the amount of micromanagement required from the player. But then other units break this principle. Nodachi Samurai exist to be devastating on the charge, but they also come with a Banzai ability for further lethality. You can set the ability to a hotkey, sure, but I'm extremely apprehensive towards timed abilities and status effects, as it may be a sign of a wider trend towards adding busy work to battles. These abilities can be designed to present interesting trade-offs, such as how Stand and Fight offers major combat buffs while immobilizing the general, leaving his horses at the risk of being scattered, hence leaving him less mobile for the remainder of the fight, and being unable to leave the state for about 45 seconds. I still advocate for designing units with properties that are inherent to them. Take Empire Total War, where rank fire and platoon fire play important roles. There is no button to click here. In custom battles and in campaign, given you've researched the text, the units will simply perform their given drills anytime they fire. Fire by rank provides a devastating barrage of casualties, while platoon fire provides more consistent fire. Against each other, with fully intact units participating, fire by rank's initial outburst allows the unit to pull ahead of its target using platoon fire. It creates an interesting dynamic where a fresh unit of basic line infantry is a dangerous opponent for a more expensive unit of guard infantry. Even winning the exchange is not ideal for the more expensive infantry, trading with a much more expendable regiment. All of these considerations are made without having to constantly toggle and detoggle an ability. The lesson was forgotten though. In Fall of the Samurai, Neilfire is an ability that needs to be toggled, and because units can't normally move while the ability is active, unless giving a direct attack order, it leaves you to constantly toggle and detoggle the ability, in battles where you may have upwards of 6 or 10 of these units. It's made especially annoying by the fact that you will almost always want to have it on. The added firepower is such a boon that there are very few combat scenarios where I wouldn't want it active. Yet Shogun 1 avoided this entirely by having firearm infantry simply adopt Neilfire if you set them up in 2 lines. Or in 3 lines, they would automatically perform a counter march, a drill that is seen again in Medieval 1 and later in Medieval 2. As someone who has gained an appreciation of games with minimalistic UIs, I have likewise come to regard any timed ability or toggleable ability with apprehension. There's a dangerous tendency for the design to evolve, or devolve, into an interface that rather than supporting the game, becomes the game, where the emphasis shifts from consistent cause and effect in a well thought out plan to watching bars fill up and timers go down so you can hit those buttons again. Rinse and repeat. Once you reach the point where many units can't act in a clearly decisive manner, there enters a problem of overloading the player with information. It's a natural conclusion to a design that fails to properly distinguish units, resulting in what is termed analysis paralysis. That describes the instance where the game grinds to a halt as you try to find what meaningful difference there is, if any, between a bunch of units. For a long time, I thought I was just weird in not being able to keep up with the bombardment of stat sheets that has dominated strategy and tactics games for years. But this really isn't an acceptable design philosophy, as it more often than not attempts to simply trick you into thinking a game is far more complex and thoughtful than it really is. Take Europa Universalis 4, a game that I have over 1,000 hours in and that I stopped playing a few years ago. The game overwhelms you with a host of idea groups that at first tantalize you into wondering all the different paths you can take your country along. Spend a bit more time engaging with the systems and try out some idea groups, and that impression falls apart as you realize that most of the ideas are incremental stat buffs that hardly impact how you play the game. Barring a few, of course, such as quantity ideas granting a substantial increase to manpower, but that again is just allowing you to wage more wars and expand more quickly. Given the opportunity costs and the amount of time to get the chance to select your next group, there are very few worth getting, and the ones that are hardly make the game more interesting. Shogun 2 allows you to research match locks, but even then you're still required to put in the work of using them effectively. The game simply isn't solved because you unlocked the end-all be-all military tech. You still have to put in the legwork. To demonstrate my point about number wang even further, Yari Ashigaru are the backbone of armies at all stages in the campaign. They will hold your line, expend themselves for the sake of your more expensive units, guard the flank against cavalry, maybe even go for the enemy general if the opportunity presents itself. And yet I couldn't even tell you what their stats are. It's not necessary. The unit description is concise, informative, and accurate, maybe not enough to make you an expert, but more than enough to get a new player going. The same extends to their Yari wall formation. There is no +5 melee defense and -20% movement speed crap. Just a few sentences that aptly describe its basic function and purpose, and the player who is left to figure out the rest by playing the game. This guy is the first king of Hyrule, he's not human. Oh no, did they breed over here? No. I'm gonna stop doing the main quest thing before I get demonetized.
工場はこれまでじゃ。勝ち戦が待っておる。その後は褒美と酒をたんまり取らすぞ。
If the story of Total War is akin to a Greek tragedy, then Shogun 2 is the point at which everything begins spiraling irreversibly into catastrophe. It took a full 9 years for the franchise to finally be endowed with a responsive interface. Campaigns have always been far too easy by the late game, Realm Divide being the only notable exception. Combat has always been marred by unit experience and general buffs. Every Total War game forces you to make some sort of major compromise, whether it's the clunky controls of the pre-Empire games, or the schizophrenic battle AI of Empire, or the absurd buffs that AI units receive in games like Warhammer. Or starting with Rome 2, the increasingly limited multiplayer options, as though the mode is only begrudgingly included at all. Shogun 2 and Fall of the Samurai present a brief moment, an instance of lightning in the bottle. For the first and only time in the series, you can fire up a game and not have to make compromises. You can crank the difficulty up to legendary and not have to deal with combat being obliterated. You can embark on a journey in Avatar Conquest, or just play battles using the standard factions, or even go as far as playing a full campaign with a friend. And to make that deal a little sweeter, the game has excellent presentation, graphically and artistically, It's the best game in the series, and therein lies the most tragic part. A game that released in 2011 should not be comparing favorably with one released in 2013, let alone ones released in 2017 or 2022. I'm just old enough to grasp a world where people expected sequels to render their predecessors obsolete. It was a given. Shogun 2 should have been just another step up the mountain. I remember feeling that way playing it back in 2013, prior to Rome 2's release. But as it turns out, we had just passed the summit and have been tumbling down the other side since then. Every time I load up the game and get inundated with the loud, percussive noises from something as simple as menu buttons, the ominous sound of artillery and distant gunfire, the subtle yet distinct differences in sound effects of swords and spears interacting with one another, and every time I outmaneuver a superior force on the campaign map and proceed to slaughter it in battle, I have one thought floating around in the depths of my mind. What could have been? In 2011, we had cataclysmic battles featuring 10,000 or more soldiers. Why did we never go past this? We had a UI that married function to form almost flawlessly. Why have we instead been forced to contend with interfaces that look like they were meant to be read by a computer? We had campaign maps rife with different expansion options. The same faction can provide you with wildly different experiences over one playthrough and another. Why are we instead being doled out unit reskins while every faction has its expansion route effectively dictated to you by the developers? Why is the franchise's best showing drifting further and further into the past? Oh, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoy listening to someone pedantically talk about Total War and military strategies, then you can hit the sub button. I upload videos for Shogun 2, Fall of the Samurai, battle replays from those games, and Medieval 2. Thinking of going into Age of Empires 2 in the near future. I also upload videos for Battlefield 1, and if you want to support me further, you can head on to my Patreon link in the description. You can also join our awesome Discord community full of people who have provided me some useful insight into these games, things that have eluded my attention previously. For those of you interested in seeing Total War at its best, you can check out my Against All Odds series, where I take in viewer saves. Sometimes difficult battles, sometimes battles that just have really interesting units, and you can hop onto Discord and send those my way. I'd like to feature more of those on the channel. Thank you so much for hanging out to this point, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye bye.